Good morning and welcome to Rising. Thank you for tuning in. We are going to start off today, of course, with the really tragic news from Washington, D.C. Niall?
And that news is that an American Airlines jet collided with an Army helicopter last night near Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Here's some footage of the actual crash.
As you can see, the helicopter hitting the plane there shortly before the plane was due to land at Ronald Reagan Airport in D.C. Just really harrowing footage. People were able to see and hear, driving along the bridge, what happened last night. Yeah, there it is. Really
chilling footage. I mean, it has, of course, been played and watched many times, and it never loses the capacity to be shocking.
We also have audio from the air traffic control. Let's play that now.
Pass 25, this is Jersey in flight. Pass 25, pass 1, this is Jersey.
Charles, you see that?
472, American 3130, go around, turn left end 250, climb maintain 3000.
Okay, left heading 350, 3000, American 3130.
Lucy 5347, go around, climb maintain 3000, flight
3000, heading heading, go around 3000, Blue Streak 5347.
Blackjack 3, can you return to base? What? Blackjack 3, proceed directly to Glebe, I need you to land. I need you to land immediately. Can you go to Dulles for a few minutes? Also 7, proceed due westbound, contact Dulles Tower 120.1. Muscle 13, can you go to Baltimore?
So here's what we know so far. There were 60 passengers and 4 crew members aboard the jet. The flight included several world champion figure skaters from both America and Russia. They were returning from a training camp. Now, so far, officials have pulled at least 28 bodies from the Potomac River. The crews believe there are no survivors, which would make this the deadliest crash in the U.S. in almost 24 years. Officials told the AP that the helicopter apparently flew into the jet's path.
One pilot on X, who goes by the handle Visionik, said that because there was both a landing and departing plane in the same airspace, the helicopter may have got confused. The crew there may have had their eyes on the departing flight and perhaps not on the one coming into land.
Now, it's noteworthy that Reagan National Airport is one of the busiest airports in the country. There are also regular military air traffic around there, in fact carrying the President of the United States and other major officials at times.
And Virginia Senator Tim Kaine expressed fears about an incident somewhat like this back in May 2024. Last year, Reagan Airport was authorized to add 5 more spots to its schedule, despite being among the busiest runways in the nation. And Kaine said last year, quote, "You're also increasing a safety risk because when you have one plane taking off or landing every minute while other planes are circling, especially in very constricted airspace like DC's airspace, you run the risk of serious challenge." Last week, President Trump fired the heads of the Transportation Security Administration and the Coast Guard. He also eliminated members of the Aviation Security Advisory Committee.
Now, the head of FAA, Mike Whitaker, had resigned on January 20th. Right now, there's a deputy but no acting head. Here is Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy.
So we are going to wait for all the information to come in from this vantage point, but to back up what the President said, what I've seen so far, do I think this was preventable? Absolutely. Prior to the collision, the flight paths that were being flown from the military and from American, that was not unusual for what happens in the D.C. airspace.
President Trump, who will be speaking later today, wrote on Truth Social, "The airplane was on a perfect and routine line of approach to the airport. The helicopter was going straight at the airplane for an extended period of time. It's a clear night. The lights on the plane were blazing. Why didn't the helicopter go up or down or turn? Why didn't the control tower tell the helicopter what to do instead of asking if they saw the plane? This is a bad situation that looks like it should have been prevented. Not good." Recently confirmed Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth addressed the crash this morning as well, saying that the helicopter flight was an annual night proficiency test. He said it was, quote, a fairly experienced crew, and that was doing a required annual night evaluation. They did have night vision goggles, end quote, on board the helicopter. So, very tragic situation, tremendous loss of life. They have not found survivors, nor do they expect to. This was a mid-air collision, giant ball of fire in the sky, plane parts dropping into freezing cold waters. So that would be remarkable if anyone could have possibly survived. It doesn't appear that they did. We are just, very much at the beginning of this. I think it is premature in any direction, and I would say that for saying, oh, it's because the safety board got cleared, or if anybody says, oh, it's because of DEI or who is flying. No, stop. Let's just wait and listen. It might be preventable in that it was a human error that should have been prevented, but not that it would have been caught by any specific safety mechanism in that it was. Now, we don't know what it is. It looks like some level of error on the helicopter flying. We don't know exactly why, or there should have been more direction from air traffic control. Again, we have to stop and wait for that information.
Yeah, I think we're very much rightly in the realm of grappling with this tragedy here, which has caused such loss of life, has been just, enormously distressing to watch, even for those of us who are not, personally involved in it, and obviously for the families that are personally involved, whether it be on the military side or on the side of people who have lost their lives in that passenger jet. It's very, very sad. I agree with you that I think it's much too early to be drawing straight lines of cause and effect, or to suggest, okay, this policy has caused it. I do think it inevitably feeds into a larger debate about cutbacks and the funding or lack of funding for things like air traffic control. I am not saying that any of those caused what happened last night, but I do think that it is just understandable and obvious that what happened last night will sharpen that debate in a very significant way.
Sure, that's fair enough, and we want to look into all of that. We want safety. We don't want Reagan, this very important airport for major diplomatic and military flights coming in and out. It needs to be and this is one of the most surveilled airspaces in the country, for good reason, to make sure there's no planes trying to be flown into government buildings anymore, that kind of thing. So that it would happen under the very nose, as it were, of federal aviation authorities and surveillance is really worrisome.
It is.
But terrible accidents do happen. Not saying it. We don't know. We got to wait to find out. And at the moment, we're just really grief-stricken. It happened just a few miles from where we're sitting now, and it's a very sober day in Washington, D.C., and our thoughts, of course, go out to the families of all those affected. We will, of course, continue covering this subject at Rising and more broadly at The Hill. Up next, we'll be discussing some other topics. Stay with us.
Robby, what is on your radar today?
Happy to tell you, Niall. Former Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, was sentenced yesterday to 11 years in prison following his conviction for charges of bribery, extortion, fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Now, this case has, for some reason, gotten less news attention than I think it should, given the enormity of the crimes that he was convicted of. 11 years is nothing to sneeze at. No senator has ever been convicted and sentenced to such a lengthy prison stint. But it reflects the extent of his appalling and obvious financial crimes. Menendez was corrupt to the core, and they proved it. The former senator acted as an unacknowledged and unregistered agent of the Egyptian government, which paid him to influence his Senate colleagues. He was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and also in gold bars, which he kept in his home. They were recovered by police during a raid. Now look, there's every reason to be skeptical of law enforcement and supportive of due process, and to not always and automatically believe prosecutors or the official narrative when it's asserted that someone is guilty. Everybody deserves the benefit of the doubt. That said, hoarding gold bars at your house is not, how do I say this, typical behavior. On the contrary, it's very good evidence that you are involved in illicit activity. Very few people keep $486,000 stuffed in their shoes or their pockets of their dry cleaning, and almost no one has 13 gold bars on hand. There was an innocent explanation for all this. Menendez obviously was unable to offer one. His attorney said the gold bars belonged to his wife, and he had no idea how she had obtained them. It's throwing her under the bus, but I don't believe it. In trying to garner sympathy, Menendez has tried every trick in the book. He went straight to identity politics initially. He had first asserted that he was being persecuted because he's a Latino. He said in a statement, quote, "Those behind this campaign simply cannot accept that a first-generation Latino American from humble beginnings could rise to be a U.S. Senator and serve with honor and distinction. It's not lost on me how quickly some are rushing to judge a Latino and push him out of his seat," end quote. Well, obviously that shameless tactic did not work, so now Menendez is trying a new tactic, begging Trump for a pardon. Now, after his sentencing, Menendez made a public statement saying that he suddenly agreed with Trump that law enforcement, the deep state, is weaponized against patriots like himself, and also our fearless leader, Donald Trump. Now, Menendez said that Trump was treated unfairly by the legal system. Trump, someone who Menendez voted to impeach twice, was right all along, and the same people going after Trump are now going after Menendez. Let's listen.
Welcome to the Southern District of New York, the Wild West of political prosecutions. President Trump is right. This process is political and it's corrupted to the core. I hope President Trump cleans up the cesspool and restores the integrity to the system.
Republicans, MAGA fans of Trump, all must resist the temptation to throw in with every corrupt Democrat who starts spouting pro-Trump talking points in order to get off the hook. The same goes, by the way, for New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who's also angling for a lifeline from Trump, and he may get it. There's rumors the Justice Department could consider dropping the case against him. Look, MAGA people, don't make yourself easy marks. Be skeptical of fair-weather friends who want to associate themselves with Trump because they're angling for preferential treatment, and it's the only choice they have. The gold bars don't lie. So this is an incredible tactic to see being deployed over and over again, the Rod Blagojevich method of getting on Trump's good side by saying the whole weaponization of the process. And look, you know from talking with me that I don't discount that there can be weaponization of the process and that it can be political and that law enforcement can, you know, has a lot of tools to pursue people more aggressively or even unfairly than I think they should. But he had gold bars in his house, stacks of cash shoved into pockets. Like, you just don't, that is itself evidence of a crime, and he was caught. So what can one say?
There are no innocent gold bars stashed in the Suave residence.
There really aren't.
No, not my place either. Look, it's always a joy to get a radar that I can unequivocally agree with. I mean, this is just kind of opportunism on the part of Bob Menendez, or the use of terms in the hope that they'll gain some sort of Pavlovian response of approval when you just say, oh, witch hunt, oh, corrupt system, and that Trump will somehow then ride to his rescue and pardon him because he wants to, I don't know, buttress the case that the Southern District of New York is biased or politicized or whatever. I obviously don't think that Trump should ride to his rescue. I don't think that he has shown any inclination that he will. The case of Eric Adams is an interesting one because there, as you say, are rumours that there could be some deal done. My personal view is that Adams is equally opportunistic. Now, he has not had his day in court. He deserves to have that. We always talk about due process.
Absolutely.
But certainly the allegations in Adams's case are serious and pretty well substantiated so far.
Yeah, they are serious and substantiated. I still want to see, you know, more evidence for his specific involvement. I don't think it yet has risen to the level of the gold bars found in the home. And Menendez has such a long history of corruption. The funny thing about him is he got away with it initially. He got in an earlier case.
Hung jury, I think.
He got a hung jury, and that was a pretty compelling case too. To get off, and he didn't, you know, he remained a senator through all that. He didn't resign in disgrace. He remained an influential foreign policy related senator, and then continued the corrupt behavior, escalated the corrupt behavior, taking these bribes, there's nothing else you can call them, from the Egyptian government. I think maybe from some other Middle Eastern government as well.
Well, I think there were individual businessmen also involved in the case as
and
well.
just absolutely lining his pockets, saying, "Oh, it's my wife. I have no idea what she was doing."
How did that happen? Where did those gold bars come from?
Where did they come from? And then he gets. So he did resign from the Senate. Democrats turned on him eventually pretty effective because it was just such a galling example of corruption. And now he's gonna try to do the Trump angle. I'm just warning Trump people not to fall for this. I'm not seeing any evidence that they are. But can you imagine all the historic criminals that could have tried out? Jeffrey Dahmer didn't know. He said, "No, I killed and ate those people." Did he eat anyone? I don't remember.
Which
he just killed people. It was just like Trump. You can't keep human remains in your freezer anymore.
But the feds knocking on your door with their agenda.
It's just so ludicrous.
It is. And also just on the ludicrous point, one of the things that I find bizarre in cases like Menendez is these people don't seem to realize that we can all see and hear what they're saying to different audiences. So in the court, just before his sentencing, he was this penitent person talking about, oh, life's so difficult now and all of that. Then he literally gets sentenced, comes outside and is like, oh, witch hunt, the system's corrupt, it's just like Trump. I mean, that's just ludicrous in itself.
The man used to spend a lot of time at my favorite cigar bar in D.C. He was there like every day.
Did you see him there yourself?
Oh yes, I saw him there multiple times. He would go there literally. I don't go there every day, right. But every time I was there, he would be there as well because he was there. I mean, this has been substantiated in court. I think they surveilled him while he was there. Okay. They tapped it, or they recorded him talking. I don't know, maybe they got me on tape too. Enjoying a cigar and seeing what senators are up to, but no more cigars for him.
Longest sentence.
11 years in prison.
Exactly, as you say, longest sentence ever for a senator or former senator.
A bipartisan effort to root out corruption in our government. We love to see it.
Absolutely.
Next up, RFK Jr. is in the hot seat again. We'll discuss his day before the Senate yesterday, and more of that is coming today. We'll talk about it. President Donald Trump's Health and Human Services pick, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., faces a second grilling before Congress today.
Here are some highlights from yesterday's hearing.
I'll comply with all the ethical guidelines.
That's not the question. You have said
you're asking me, Senator, you're asking me not to sue vaccine pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, you are. That's exactly what you're doing.
The receipts show that Mr. Kennedy has embraced conspiracy theories, quacks, charlatans, especially when it comes to the safety and efficacy of vaccines.
Right now, as I understand it, on their website, they are selling what's called onesies. These are little things, clothing for babies. Are you supportive of this?
I've had nothing to do with leadership.
Are you supportive of these onesies?
I'm supportive of vaccines.
Are you supportive of this clothing, which is militantly anti-vaccine?
I am supportive of vaccines. Right. I want good science.
And here's Kennedy responding to a question asking him if he was a conspiracy theorist.
That label was applied to me because I said that the vaccines, the COVID vaccine, didn't prevent transmission and it wouldn't prevent infection when the government was telling people, Americans, that it would. Now everybody admits it. I was called a conspiracy theorist because I said red dye caused cancer. And now FDA has acknowledged that and banned it. I was called a conspiracy theorist because I said fluoride lowered IQ. Last week, JAMA published a meta-review of 87 studies saying that there's a direct inverse correlation between IQ loss.
All right, so I'm going to assume
I could go on for about a week.
American attorney and editor-in-chief of Midas Touch Network, Ron Flipkowski, wrote on Blue Sky yesterday, Trump didn't choose RFK Jr. because he thought he was the best person for the job, as RFK keeps saying today. Trump trashed him repeatedly last year. But Trump's internal polling showed he needed RFK's voters to win. That's the sole reason he picked him, politics, not health.
Coming from the other angle, Fox News host Judge Jeanine Pirro wrote on X, "I'm disgusted that in 2025 we're so divided we cannot get behind RFK's message that all Americans live a healthy and fit life. The left would rather smear him as anti-vax than unite behind a man who wants to conquer chronic illness, obesity, autism, as well as the pharmaceutical monopoly on our lives. This goes beyond politics. It's about our humanity. Wake up." Political strategist and activist Scott Pressler issued this warning: "I will dedicate my time to defeating senators that do not confirm RFK Jr., even those that are Republican. May I remind you that our work helped to defeat Bob Casey in Pennsylvania. I'll even take it a step further and work to defeat ranked choice voting in Alaska. Just try me." So this was a very contentious hearing yesterday. A lot of back and forth between RFK Jr. and several Democrats, even though RFK Jr. was, until very recently, a member of the Democratic Party and challenged Biden from within the Democratic Party. Look, I certainly think it is fair to grill RFK Jr. on his past comments about vaccines and a number of other subjects. He affirmed over and over and over again in the hearings yesterday that he does not think of himself as anti-vaccine. He thinks there should be more scientific rigor and studies about approving them and the efficacy of them, but his beef is not with vaccines themselves. That did not satisfy a lot of the Democrats, but then they were just having the same conversation with them saying, well, on this podcast 5 years ago, you said this. And then in a couple times he had to go, well, I got cut off before I finished, like when he said no vaccine is safe. They said, well, how could you be pro-vaccine and say that? He said, well, then I got interrupted by the podcast host. I was going to say for every single person. It is true that you can have a vaccine that we would generally consider, completely safe, but even set aside vaccines, just pharmaceutical or any product in general, if it kills, or not even kill, has some negative impact on 1 in a million people, that's often the case, that we still consider it safe. But that's what his point was. So I think it was actually helpful for him to illustrate some of his actual views, and I expect he will be confirmed, but with zero Democratic support.
So my basic take of it is him suggesting that he is pro-vaccine, as he did at times during yesterday's hearing, is pretty disingenuous of him. I don't think there's any way you can fair-mindedly look at Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s record on vaccines and say that he is pro-vaccine. At the very most generous end of the spectrum, I would think you would describe him as extremely skeptical of vaccines. He contends at other times that he wants them to be tested thoroughly. Vaccines are tested very thoroughly as it is. They have made enormous strides. He continues to traffic in, at the least, I would say, disingenuous information dating back to things like the polio vaccine, which he keeps harking back to an element in that original vaccine that hasn't been in it for decades. But I'm not sure that he did himself that much of a favor, less for the vaccine issue, where I think people have already decided what they think about him, but more because he did have a couple of weird stumbles over Medicare and Medicaid, where he seemed to suggest that, first of all, he said Medicaid premiums were too high.
I think he simply misspoke, right, when he said he was referring to Medicare. But.
Well, when he was pressed, though, by a Republican senator, Bill Cassidy, on plans to reform Medicaid, he was kind of filibustering and answering in very, very nebulous terms. He also said that Medicaid was completely paid for by the federal government, which it isn't. The states contribute, although the federal government pays the majority of the amount of money. So I think that may have caused him more damage in terms of the overall fight for confirmation.
I thought I did my personal view, but you might disagree, and maybe liberals and progressives saw completely the opposite way. I thought he was getting the better of Elizabeth Warren specifically, when she was really harping on whether he was profiting from having opposed vaccines. He was like, well, but the pharmaceutical industry is profiting from making vaccines, more available or approving them more rapidly. So someone is profiting either way. So what are you even getting on about? I thought that was a fair point.
Yeah, I mean, I think her argument was that he had drawn those profits from his work, and then if he is confirmed, he will have responsibility for areas from which he has previously profited. Sadly, to my mind, that isn't all that unusual in government service.
I mean, Scott Gottlieb goes directly from government service to the former head of, I think, the FDA to sitting on the board of Pfizer, and what can you?
Yeah, I mean, the revolving door, I think, is an unfortunate trait in Washington politics, and that does go across party lines. It's not what I would have most grievance or most objection to Robert F. Kennedy for.
It's interesting to see. So I expect him to get. I expect him to be confirmed. There are oppositions to RFK Jr. on the right because he is and has been very pro-choice, and there are some policy-relevant areas for HHS in terms of abortion funding. So he's been opposed by some more social conservative, or even establishment conservative publications and organizations. So it's interesting that people like Scott Presler, who's a major get out the vote drive person on the right, saying that if you oppose him, I will come after you. That actually is a significant, that's just not some guy spouting off on social media. If you're a Republican, you do not want Scott Presler working against you. Let me guarantee you of that. I think it is the point. I read a column at Fox News yesterday, and this is kind of true, and it's more how politics used to work, the transactional. Look, RFK Jr., quasi-endorsing Trump by the end, or getting on board and pulling himself out in a couple states and helping to get, that made a difference. I think there's no argument that it didn't. And if that was done in exchange for the kind of political relevance he wanted to have in the administration, I don't know how you don't live up to that promise if you're Trump. I mean, Trump is attempting to live up to that promise. He's giving him the position that I suppose is the one RFK Jr. wanted. You just, I mean, Trump needed those RFK supportive people who might have been MAGA otherwise and ended up being MAGA. He needed RFK Jr. to get on board to make his reelection more likely. RFK Jr. did, so I kind of see and agree with the argument from a Republican Party standpoint that even if this guy isn't ideal from the standpoint of all social conservative or conservative priorities, that you just kind of got to do it this time.
Yeah, I mean, I would need to look back at how many votes Kennedy was getting and how he was polling at the end, because he had certainly faded in the polls the longer his campaign went on, which is never a great sign for any politician, but it's certainly possible that in some of the swing states it may have made a difference. I was interested on the abortion question. It was Maggie Hassan, a Democratic senator from New Hampshire, who raised that in the most pointed way, saying kind of sardonically that she was happy to see so many of her Republican colleagues willing to vote for a pro-choice nominee as HHS secretary. And just finally, on the confirmation point, I do think it'll be interesting to see Bill Cassidy, the senator from Louisiana, is chairing today's hearing. He is a physician. He worked as a physician for decades, and he has seemed pretty lukewarm toward Kennedy for various reasons. It'll be interesting to see how he goes, because there are, after all, 3 Republican senators who did vote against Pete Hegseth. They've shown a willingness to buck the Trump line in that respect. We'll see how that goes for RFK Jr.
Yes, we will. Coming up, more rising. 2 more of Trump's cabinet picks are being grilled today. Tulsi Gabbard and also Kash Patel. We'll talk about it. Stick around. Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel, 2 big names, popular figures in MAGA world, looking to secure their spots in President Donald Trump's cabinet. They are currently facing their hearings on Capitol Hill.
Patel, some might say surprisingly, just distanced himself from Trump on a hot topic. Here he is.
We discussed in our private meeting, Senator, I have always rejected any violence against law enforcement, and I have, including in that group, specifically addressed any violence against law enforcement on January 6th, and I do not agree with the commutation of any sentence of any individual who committed violence against law enforcement.
So do you?
Patel did blast Biden, however. Let's listen to that.
I also believe America is not safer because President Biden's commutation of a man who murdered 2 FBI agents, Agent Kohler's and Williams' family, deserve better than to have the man that point blank range fired a shotgun into their heads and murdered them released from prison. So it goes both ways.
So far, Patel seems to be earning unanimous support from Republicans.
Republican Senator Thom Tillis, for example, told Fox News Digital yesterday that he's pushing for Patel as head of the FBI. Tillis is noteworthy because he was initially hesitant on another Trump cabinet pick, Pete Hegseth, but did end up supporting him.
Here's a viral Patel clip from September 2024.
And the biggest problem the FBI has come out of its intel shops. I'd break that component out of it. I'd shut down the FBI Hoover building on day 1 and reopening the next day as a museum of the deep state. And I'd take the 7,000 employees that work in that building and send them across America to chase down criminals. Go be cops. You're cops. Go be cops. Go chase down murderers and rapists and drug dealers and violent offenders. What do you need 7,000 people there for?
Gabbard, however, is another story. There are three main issues her opponents tend to cite: her visit with former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in 2017, her former stance on FISA Section 702, and her defense of Edward Snowden.
Snowden, as a lot of you know, was a government contractor who leaked troves of classified government data for what he believed was informing the public about gross abuses of surveillance. Gabbard has introduced a bill during her tenure in Congress that would protect whistleblowers like Snowden, who is viewed by many civil liberties supporters as a hero.
Snowden was, however, charged with espionage, and he now lives in Russia. Senator Susan Collins of Maine told the New York Times, "One of my greatest concerns is how she, Gabbard, views Edward Snowden in light of the resolution that she co-authored with Matt Gaetz, calling for all criminal charges against him, which were extremely serious and involved sharing highly classified information with our adversaries, to be dropped." Then there's her former opposition to FISA Section 702. As the editors of National Review, a conservative publication, wrote earlier this month, she long opposed Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which allows us to monitor the communications of non-Americans located outside the United States. This is a little like a Secretary of Defense nominee being opposed to building tanks. Then, of course, we have Gabbard's meeting with Assad in 2017.
Gabbard had warned that removing Assad would turn Syria into chaos and allow for terrorists to fill the power vacuum.
Here's Democrat Senator Mark Kelly on Face the Nation recently discussing Gabbard's trip.
What concerns me more, especially about that trip, is it was common knowledge that Assad was gassing the civilian population, using chemical weapons against the population multiple times. And she didn't argue about those, but she took the time and the effort to make a case that there were two cases, and she used, experts that were not credible to try to prove that he was not using chemical weapons in those two instances. And I have a hard time understanding why you would want to do that, to use your political capital.
But in Gabbard's defense, according to a report from Aaron Mate for Real Clear Investigations, Gabbard has never offered support for Assad or issued a blanket denial of chemical weapons used by his recently ousted government. In 2020, Gabbard described Assad as a brutal dictator and said that there is evidence that both his forces and anti-government insurgents had used chemical weapons. Vice President J.D. Vance wrote on X, "In their own way, both Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. represent parts of the new coalition in our party. To say they're unwelcome in the cabinet is an insult to our new voters. To reject their confirmation is to reject the idea that President Trump decides his cabinet." And even Edward Snowden himself chimed in, writing, "Tulsi Gabbard will be required to disown all prior support for whistleblowers as a condition of confirmation today. I encourage her to do so. Tell them I harm national security and the sweet, soft feelings of staff in D.C. That's what passes for the Pledge of Allegiance." So, two figures to discuss, Kash Patel and Tulsi.
A lot here.
Where would you like to start?
Well, I would have more of a criticism of Kash Patel than I would of Tulsi Gabbard, but I know that you're pro-Tulsi Gabbard.
And Kash Patel. Actually, I think I'm unequivocally pro-Kash Patel.
Okay. Well, I will take the anti-Kash Patel position then.
But you were probably glad to hear him acknowledge that he disagreed with... In fact, it's rare to hear anyone even express disagreement with Donald Trump. I disagree with... similarly, commuting the sentences of people who engage in violence, and so does Kash Patel, and that's comforting to hear, is it not?
I thought that was to his credit that he said that today, and I think that, obviously, I think he's right. We have discussed January the 6th and my feelings about what happened on that day, and yours quite a lot. I thought the commutations were a disgraceful and shameful moment. In relation, though, to Kash Patel more generally, what I was struck by watching the clip of him distancing himself from Trump in that way was how different that person appears from the Kash Patel that we showed on those other clips, talking in this cartoonish fashion about how he would empty out the Hoover building on day one, send people across the country to chase criminals, as if it's some sort of cops and robbers game, or as if the intelligence element of police work doesn't exist. I find him very dubious in that way. I find him very dubious in his propensity to ventilate lies about people helping Joe Biden to rig elections. And, I also find his behavior toward Trump in general very, very craven, which is why I'm surprised at the distancing over January the 6th. There was a CPAC appearance back in 2023 when, I just love this quote because of its ludicrousness, "We're blessed by God to have Donald Trump be our juggernaut of justice."
Well, he's supportive of Donald Trump, and he says pro-Trump things to say. And I can't co-sign every statement he's ever made, obviously, and I'm sure if he might have said things related to January 6th or the election that I disagree with. But when I hear him say that he wants to reform the FBI and get it back to more of a law enforcement purpose, that there are people doing duplicative intelligence analysis there that they don't even know why they're doing it, that seems fine with me. I also appreciate, and this has been undercovered, that he actually has history as a public defender. He worked in Florida representing drug dealers, murderers, smugglers, and I think that is it because there is, and sometimes it's not political, the weaponization of law enforcement, just the tremendous power of the criminal justice system to grind down people. I think it is good to have someone who's seen the other side of the legal system and has an inclination in their head about what it's like for people accused of things, even when they're guilty, if they're guilty as sin.
But let me come in on that, Robbie, because I agree with the point that you have just made in an abstract sense. And to be fair to you, I've no doubt that you're making that in good faith. You genuinely believe that often the police and justice element of society can be overly repressive. And I think that's fine, and an argument that lots of people on the Liberal side also share. I think the problem is attaching that good faith argument to someone like Kash Patel, who is so craven toward Trump, who is so prone to these inflammatory statements of all kinds, and who has talked about utilizing the mechanics of that system to go after people who are Trump's enemies and by extension his enemies. That's where I think the argument just gets completely separated. What he's talking about is using those powers to which you rightly object simply to pursue different people.
Well, let's move to Tulsi Gabbard, who I like a lot of what she has to say and represents. I was dismayed personally to see her flip on this FISA a 702 authorization thing, which is very, very much something that civil libertarians are opposed, and we're happy about her because she was also against. She said that there were sufficient reforms to it, and now she's supportive of it. She said that to win some support from lawmakers. So that was actually an example of her, catering to more mainstream or establishment support, where I actually liked her initial position much better. Then, the kind of bipartisan security state going after her for thinking that Edward Snowden did something, yes, illegal, but also heroic and important, and should be that, the importance of the contribution should be acknowledged because we want to incentivize whistleblowers to speak up when our government is engaged in illegal behavior or wrongdoing. That is a good thing. I totally agree with her on that. I agree with people on both sides of the political spectrum who share that view from I don't know what their exact view is, but presumably from AOC type people all the way to Rand Paul type people. And that's a good thing. So not only does it not disqualify her in my view, it's to her credit. And to see that be the reason that establishment Republicans are wary of her and establishment Democrats don't like her is very that makes me concerned about them, not her.
I think that is fair enough. I think some of the criticism, I'm in a bit of a nuanced position where she's concerned, because I think some of the criticism of her is unfair, actually, and then I think some of it's pretty fair. So like the meeting with Assad, for example, I wouldn't defend at all, and I think that's a huge question mark over her. On the flip side, on the more sympathetic to her side, Hillary Clinton basically came out and said straight out that Tulsi Gabbard was a Russian asset, without, as the New York Times always says about Donald Trump, accusing without evidence. Or, you can't just come out and make those kind of statements about people as a blanket assertion without anything to back it up. So I think that is unfair. I think sometimes Gabbard makes kind of nuanced arguments herself, like talking about, NATO expansionism, for example. I am not of the view that NATO expansionism justifies invading Ukraine, but I think that it is a valid topic to talk about, and sometimes I think people who criticize her imply that it's not a valid topic to talk about, and I don't love that position.
Indeed. Well, I predict they will both be confirmed, but we will have to see. Lots more coming next, including why did Vivek Ramaswamy really leave DOGE? Stay tuned. Well, Vivek Ramaswamy, no longer the yin to Elon Musk's yang. During a sit-down with the Breakfast Club on Tuesday, the former co-chief of the Department of Government Efficiency asserted that his exit from DOGE was amicable, a defense that Charlamagne Tha God quickly took issue with. Let's take a listen.
You think you were pushed out of DOGE because Trump rolled back the DEI initiatives?
No, to the contrary. And, I would say, just to be super clear about it, I have no problem with, framing or whatever. It was really just an actual mutual decision where you look at, here was one vision on approach. Here's a different vision on an approach. That's great. There's no right or wrong answer.
I hear you, Vivek. I don't believe you.
Oh, that's fair
but
enough.
I think you either got pushed out or you know that it's going to implode. I think that Elon is going to crash and burn it, and you're a smart guy, and you said, you know what? Let me get out of Dodge and go do my Governor of Ohio thing.
Ramaswamy was supposed to help lead the new group tasked with shrinking government bloat, but his stint was almost dead on arrival. Here's more from the man himself.
One of my core areas of focus throughout has been the constitutional and legal basis for shutting down the bureaucracy and the federal government and downsizing it. That's what I focused, written my books on, et cetera. It evolved in more of a direction of a technology project, using a technology-first approach. And so Elon and I were on good terms. We have a good personal relationship, slightly different approaches to the project. And what he and I both concluded, and I think this is right, is given my focus on law, on legislation, the right way to realize my vision is through elected office. And
the biotech entrepreneur is expected to make a run for the Ohio governorship. The Hill has reported that he tapped Vice President J.D. Vance's top political advisors ahead of an announcement in that regard. So Vivek says it was a friendly parting of the ways, differences in strategy between him and Elon, and he's more
musical differences have broken up the band here, right?
I guess
it's all
so.
Very innocent sounding.
Who knows what the real story is? That could very well be the real story, that it was kind of weird to have two people in charge of this anyway. It's the Department of Government Efficiency. Do we need to have two people in charge of it?
Yeah, well, that's a fair point. And it was also two people who have pretty strong personalities and I would say a pretty strong desire for the spotlight in and of themselves. There has certainly been some reporting that there were tensions within that arrangement. Elon Musk, who we have discussed numerous times before, is obviously still in the center of the Trump world. Vivek Ramaswamy, to my mind, appears to have lost some sort of battle for influence. I think he did, to be fair, implicitly acknowledge that when he said the thing to Charlamagne about the two different approaches. His argument, I think, is that Musk favors a technology-driven kind of data analytics approach to it. I'm not exactly sure what Ramaswamy means when he talks about a constitutional approach or a legislative approach. Perhaps he meant, I don't know, driving legislation through Congress that would get rid of certain departments. That seems to be what he's suggesting there. Obviously, a difference in those two approaches.
If that approach has been sidelined, it's a shame, because to make cuts to government spending permanent and robust, it can't just be by executive fiat. It needs to make its way through legislation. And there's a remarkable opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity, an opportunity that might never present itself again to do just that, with Republicans controlling right now all three branches of government and having a mostly supportive Supreme Court. So please do something. So I hope Vivek was not sidelined for that reason. I would remind everyone that for the most, ideologically, Vivek and Elon have been more on the same side. They were very famously on the same side of the H-1B visa fight, for which they both took a lot of flack from the more populist MAGA wing. Steve Bannon called for Elon Musk to be thrown out of the Trump coalition. Vivek did fall pretty unusually silent after his own tweet about the immigration situation, where he likened it to, Americans aren't idolizing nerds, and he made like a Saved by the Bell reference. You remember that whole thread? Yeah. Between that and the New York Magazine, I tweeted this yesterday, cover of the pro-Trump celebrators, and how it's like they're the mean kids in high school. Everyone seems is projecting their own high school experience onto the national political situation in a very weird way to me. But Vivek got a lot of blowback from that, so I don't know if that led to his, just because it was not a metaphor that people really appreciate. I agree with Vivek on policy substantively pretty much down the line. I did not agree with how he framed that exact argument, because American innovation and entrepreneurship and success it takes a mixture of personalities. The nerd, but also the jock, the charismatic figure, the leader. It's not just all technical skills for which certain immigrant communities who come here are known for. That is a very important ingredient in our success, but we can't all just be computer science obsessed automatons. We need leadership and vision and all that kind of stuff too.
Well, absolutely, but also the way in which that message was delivered had a very obvious and ostentatious sort of wag of the finger to it, and I don't think that tends to go down terribly well with people. The H-1B visa argument was certainly an interesting argument because it pitted Vivek and Elon and those kind of people against.
And they won. They got Trump to pretend he was in favor of the policy all along.
They did, which he obviously was not, and had stated that he was not, and so they did prevail on that occasion, despite the fact that Steve Bannon is still talking about how he's going to, in some way get retribution's perhaps too strong a word, but he believes that he can ultimately drive out those oligarchic forces and restore MAGA to its working
Not on
class,
my
right?
watch.
I know that you're big in favor of the oligarchs. I know. And speaking of which, I mean, I'm obviously much less enthusiastic than you are about the cutting of government spending. Generally, Elon has this goal that he had said in the past of $2 trillion being cut from government spending. I think that would hollow out services that are important. I think that if Trump goes ahead with this full-bore agenda, what is going to happen is that people will be reminded in very forcible terms that there are things that the government does that are useful and necessary, and that if they are stopped from doing it, whether that is Medicaid or whether that is a whole measure of government actions, that they will, Veterans Affairs, all kinds of things that could be negatively affected. We'll see how that works out.
I mean, maybe, but this is what Elon does. He comes in and makes companies more efficient. I mean, he bought Twitter. He fired 80% of the workforce, and I know there's a lot of people who don't like the way it is now, but that has to do with the content moderation decisions being made. The site still operates perfectly well with an 80% reduction in the workforce. I don't know, man.
But the point is, I think, and it's interesting you use the word company. My argument, and I think a lot, people who have a different view would say the government isn't a company. The government, by its nature, has to do things or should do things that are unprofitable, but socially necessary. That's different from a private or publicly listed company where the profit motive is the animating force.
Well, I think that's true to an extent, although the profit motive can be an important driver in delivering just in competition to provide service. Not all goods and services, things we need, are provided publicly or provided by the government, and there's obviously robust markets in providing people's food and clothing and all sorts of other things. I tend to think government, you're right, it's not perfect because it still costs something, and there's some people who can't even afford what it costs in robust and competitive markets, and so you have, maybe my view of government is for emergency situations or things where you don't want competition in providing the service, like policing and military benefits, the actual ostensible purpose of government, kind of in our philosophical John Locke-esque understanding of what it does. But I don't know. I think some efficiencies could be introduced in terms of it being a provider of services, some of which are also provided privately and more efficiently and more cheaply and better. Let's try to make it more like that.
I think we need a social safety net. I think that social safety net in this country is very, very fragile and flimsy as it is, to the great detriment of a lot of citizens, particularly lower income citizens. And I think government has a very important role to play there, Robby.
All right, coming up is MLK Jr. Day in jeopardy. We will discuss that. Stay with us.
President Trump's ban on federal DEI programs sparked the Defense Department's intelligence agency to issue a memo that orders a pause to what it calls agency special emphasis programs. That means there will be a pause on observances of Pride Month, Holocaust Days of Remembrance, and other cultural and historical annual events. Independent journalist Ken Klippenstein, who first reported the contents of the memo, posted on X, quote, "Intelligence officials are starting to leak to me now too. Here's a memo Defense Intelligence Agency personnel received instructing them to suspend observances, including Holocaust Remembrance Day, MLK Day, Juneteenth." The memo, however, states the pause will, quote, "not affect the federal holidays, including MLK Day and Juneteenth." Still, the unprecedented move has drawn criticism. Colour of Change posted, quote, "This is just the start. Government agencies will refuse to recognise these important holidays first, and more institutions will follow."
Conservative X-account Liberty Times and Politics posted, quote, "Good, now the DIA will have time and resources to actually investigate the national defense of the country." Look, I am very wary of how this is all being framed. First of all, there's no power to end federal holidays here. Like, these are federally recognized holidays. If you read the memo closely, it clarifies that they're not saying that they're going to get rid of the holidays. I'm also not sure. This reminds me of when, Florida, for instance, says, okay, stop having like absolutely pornographic books in the school libraries, and then some teacher says, oh, I had to get rid of like the bluest eye from my classroom. Then we say, well, no one is saying you have to get rid of the bluest eye. They're saying this like instruction manual for teenagers to have sex can't appear in the library. And this actually happened with teaching of the Tuskegee Airmen. Did you see that the other day?
Yeah, I saw the headline. Go ahead.
Right. Again, it's a quintessential case where some activist within the department said, oh, yes, this order stops us from doing this. And then, to his credit, Pete Hegseth swiftly clarified, absolutely not. You can still do that. We're not saying you can't do that anymore. We're just saying you can't do DEI training, race-based hiring, that kind of stuff. So similarly, I don't know what this means by, now maybe it is actually exactly as Ken suggests, but we're not getting rid of those holidays. I don't know what not observing the days actually means, or whether that is consistent with what the message from Trump actually is. I guess we'll find out. But I'm very skeptical.
So on the point of, you're saying that you can't just erase federal holidays, but I assume there is some flexibility on the degree to which one observes federal holidays by giving people time off and so forth. So it seems to me at least theoretically possible that the existence of the holiday and the observance of the holiday are two separate things, and that Ken could be right in that regard. Now, the broader point here, I think, is that the assault that Trump would proudly, I think, say that he is carrying out on DEI is something that is causing confusion in all of these areas, because what do the terms actually mean? And so people on the right are often inclined to choose the most, we've talked before about DEI training sessions that seem to have rather specious lessons within them, and not the more universally accepted importance of, for example, acknowledging and observing Martin Luther King Day, which is obviously, I think, self-evidently important given the man's enormous, momentous significance to the country. This is something that, even though we're only a very short distance into the Trump administration, is manifesting itself over and over again. There was another executive order in recent days about anti-Semitism in colleges, but it was accompanied by a fact sheet in which Trump seemed to be suggesting that anyone who attended a pro-Palestinian march and wasn't a citizen or was on a student visa could be deported. Now, the gap between anti-Semitism and going to a pro-Palestinian march is pretty vast. So here, there's a pretty vast difference between saying, well, this particular DEI training session seems superfluous or odd in some way, and saying we shouldn't observe Martin Luther King Day.
Yeah, so I'm looking at, I pulled up the memo now. Martin Luther King and Juneteenth have little asterisks next to them, and then at the bottom it says, this is in the memo, it says this pause will not affect the federal holidays. So they're not intending to do that. Now, I agree with you that, the president just declaring an end to DEI or whatever is going to create confusion. So this is something that Congress should look into to make sure that we're only funding programs that are consistent with what the American people want, or consistent with what Congress has actually funded, and is consistent with laws that already prevent discrimination on these bases. But yeah, as I said earlier, I very much I think there's a little getting over our skis here.
Well, I don't know. Our friends in the control room tell me that AP has confirmed the authenticity of the memo that Ken has reported.
Well, it's on the memo. I mean, I'm looking at the memo right now. Maybe you can put it on the screen. It says the pause will not affect the federal holidays. That's on the memo itself.
And that am I being told that some U.S. official is confirming the memo or is confirming the specificity of?
I'm not alleging that the memo is made up. I'm looking at it. I think it's a real
memo. But you say that the memo does not require the ceasing of observation.
It insists that there will not be a ceasing of the holidays. It says this pause will not affect the federal holidays. So.
Right. So apparently it notes a pause on special observances. So I don't know. There's some ambiguity in that respect. Anyway, are we in agreement that Martin Luther King Day should be observed?
Yes.
Excellent.
I guess, yes.
Good start. Good start from these things.
Maybe we can get Ken on soon to discuss what he
dig
thinks
into this
reporting has uncovered. More to come on Rising. Stay tuned. Here's an idea I know Niall will love. Republican Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna has introduced a bill on Tuesday to carve President Trump's face onto Mount Rushmore. That would be alongside George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, and also Abraham Lincoln. Luna wrote on X, his remarkable accomplishments for our country and the success he will continue to deliver deserve the highest recognition and honor on this iconic national monument.
The Florida Congresswoman is not the first one suggesting the idea. Panelists on Fox News, of course, voiced support. Let's watch.
Hey, there's room up there. I think it'd be great. I think what Donald Trump has done and is in the process of doing is transforming the United States of America and putting America first. And I think America loves it. And I think there's a great case for it.
Taylor? Yeah, I'm fascinated by this because that would be some sweet irony after President Joe Biden stopped the fireworks display from Mount Rushmore. So if you did the 250th anniversary of the country at Mount Rushmore with President Trump's face, it would be epic.
Not quite sure what to say about that, but in any event, President Trump back in 2020 did post a picture of himself, and there it is, standing in front of Mount Rushmore. In 1999, Congress debated and later rejected adding President Ronald Reagan to the historic South Dakota hills.
Trump aide and former campaign manager Corey Lewandowski had this to say on the issue.
Donald Trump's face on Mount Rushmore, okay? What are we waiting on? We can rename the Ronald Reagan Airport. It used to be National Airport. It's now Ronald Reagan. I love Reagan. Go put Donald Trump's face on Mount Rushmore. We got the votes in the House. We got the votes in the Senate. I know a guy's going to sign it named Donald John Trump. Let's get it done to memorialize what this man's been able to achieve for this country.
And last week, another bill was introduced to rename the Washington Dulles International Airport after Trump. We could name everything after Trump. We could maybe this mug, the Trump
studio, the Donald Trump Rising studio.
First of all, Dulles is such a horrible airport, and I feel bad even talking about air travel related things on such a solemn day here. But Dulles is not my favorite airport. It's no one's favorite airport, so I'm not sure Donald Trump would want such an airport to be named after him. What about his face on Mount Rushmore?
Well, I mean, what can I even begin to say about this? I mean, obviously, I do not think that Donald Trump should be on Mount Rushmore. Obviously, I think it is an absurd idea.
What if we replaced all the faces with Trump, and it was just Trump's face 4 times?
4 times around. Perhaps we could have his
different
little
poses.
Could we have his little tiny hands on there as well?
Maybe we could get some animatronics going.
I
mean, a little thing like
look,
this.
We don't even want to contemplate that, Robbie. But look, the whole point here is these people, formerly serious people, just beclowning themselves. Jason Chaffetz, for example, supporting the carving of Donald Trump's face onto Mount Rushmore. To me, it's just evidence of this kind of craven behavior where Donald Trump has transformed the Republican Party into this kind of court in the medieval sense, with all these courtiers trying to get his favor all the time, whether it's Corey Lewandowski going on some podcast to say it. Lewandowski, in his defense, seemed to, I think, have a little bit of humor in his voice about it, considering or underlining a slightly absurdist element to it all. But look, this is all about people trying to kiss up to Trump in the most oleaginous way possible.
Look, do I largely agree with you? Yes.
Excellent.
I think it is very silly to discuss changing Mount Rushmore to add anyone who is still a a current political figure and a controversial one, even though there are a lot of supporters, there are also a lot of detractors. We should probably only celebrate. We should just leave Mount Rushmore the way it is. There's no reason to do anything more with it, but I think enough time has to pass for us to construct how we feel about a person. Now,
I would say enough time has passed to put a second Roosevelt up there. I would put FDR up there, of course.
I don't know about, he's too... I wouldn't support that. Eisenhower would be my suggestion for an addition to Mount Rushmore. Eisenhower is at least someone who deserves... FDR has a very nice and very significant and large memorial here in Washington, D.C. Eisenhower, who in addition to being a well-regarded president, even by both sides of the political spectrum, is a war hero and helped win World War II against the Nazis, and I think would be someone worth memorializing. I just pulled it up. I knew I'd be able to find it. Guess who formally suggested that Barack Obama's face should be added to Mount Rushmore? Our good friend Don Lemon. So there are some sycophants over there too.
I was actually in a state of suspense to know who it would be, and it was good old Don. I must say, Nancy Pelosi just last year suggested that President Biden should eventually go up there, but I don't think, in fairness to Pelosi, she was suggesting immediately. Perhaps she was. The point is, even setting aside the absurdity of putting these people up right now, the whole point of memorializing people is that it is almost always done posthumously, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the idea of putting Trump,
putting Teddy Roosevelt was added pretty quick.
I think
it was not that much in. Was he? I don't know when while I look up when Mount Rushmore was carved.
I'll just filibuster when you try to figure out when Teddy Roosevelt was added.
Construction started in 1927, so he was still alive, and that was only a decade after he'd been president.
Yeah, it was not that far away, which strengthens my case for FDR, who's been decades past and one of our greatest presidents.
Yeah.
Not Donald Trump, not the dullest Donald Trump international airport, not Donald Trump added to Mount Rushmore. We'll just stall on all those.
I don't know who's the political figure I like least. I would name Dulles after them because it's not a fun experience flying out of there.
It's not. It's certainly not. I mean, I do think we're having understandably kind of fun with this topic, but I do think part of it is just Republicans offering a sort of excessive tributes of praise to Trump, or trying to suggest things that they know will never happen to just cater favor. It was Andy Ogles, I think, who the congressman from Tennessee, who wanted to change the Constitution to provide for a third Trump term. That's another of these things that is put up in a fanciful way just to be in the good group.
I mean, look, I take umbrage at these things just as much as you do, but I was kind of. I wasn't kidding, but flippantly bringing up the Don Lemon thing. There was a lot. We kind of forget about it now because it's a little bit in the rearview mirror. But the level of fawning over Obama, and Biden didn't get this treatment to the same degree nearly from the press and from Democratic officials. But there was a lot of celebrity worship of Obama from the get-go.
I think there was a lot of understandable respect for the man's political skills and abilities.
I mean, there were people wanting him to serve a third term too. I remember reading columns from liberals saying, "Oh my God, get rid of this this constitutional amendment that stops."
Also he'd have been a much better candidate, even running for a third term, than Hillary Clinton would have been, and so he would have perhaps prevented a Donald Trump presidency. But that's not how it works.
Nope. You can't stop him from perhaps being on Mount Rushmore. No, that is something that can absolutely be
stopped. Stop that immediately.
Unlikely to happen. More to come on Rising. Stay tuned. More delicious legacy media drama.
Former New York Times writer Paul Krugman just released an article on The Contrarian detailing his rationale for leaving the Grey Lady.
The great former New York Times columnist writes, despite the
encomiums.
What is that word?
Encomiums.
I've never heard that word before.
Praise.
Issued by the Times, it was not a happy departure. Thank you for setting me straight there, Niall. From my perspective, the nature of my relationship with the Times had degenerated to a point where I couldn't stay.
Krugman then went into specifics. Faced attempts from others to dictate what I could and could not write about, usually in the form you've already written about that. As if it never takes more than one column to effectively cover a subject. If that had been the rule during my earlier tenure, I would never have been able to press the case for Obamacare or against Social Security privatization, and, most alarmingly, against the Iraq invasion. Krugman added that Times opinion writers were banned from engaging in media criticism.
Krugman also told the Columbia Journal-Review recently that he approached the days he wrote his columns with dread and often spent the afternoon in rage after they were published.
Krugman says the editors made his life hell.
Tech and media journalist Simon Owens wrote on X, "The New York Times told Paul Krugman he was publishing too much content. He quit, launched a Substack newsletter." This is another example of the legacy media failing to understand how much the power balance has shifted in recent years. Star journalists are less enamored with the imprimatur of a newspaper brand, and at the same time they crave the creative and financial freedom that comes with launching an independent media brand.
Paul Krugman's very upset all of a sudden, which is kind of weird because he was kind of feted, I thought, in the New York Times and was celebrated, and it was a big moment for them when he departed. And
yeah, they said nice things about him, and he was like, "Thank you," and by the way, F you.
Really having a go at them.
So Paul Krugman, full disclosure, is by
You're not
no
a big
means
fan, I would imagine.
my favorite columnist. While I, of course, recognize that he is a very smart man and is an eloquent representative of a side that I don't often agree with, although, of course, I agree with his opposition to the Iraq War, and I'm glad he made that case in a newspaper that was otherwise pretty supportive of said war. It is weird. He says they didn't want him to write as much on this blog, and he was like, well, then I'm not satisfied, so I'm going to write my own Substack blog thing, and they're like, okay, well, now you can have it. They over time installed more guardrails on what he could do. That's frustrating for anyone, I'm sure. So I understand and sympathize with his concerns there, and they're right that a big enough person as he is can absolutely thrive on their own on a Substack. So that contrarian is the Jennifer Rubin little Substack that she started after departing the Washington Post. I don't know if this means he's going to write for them regularly. That would actually be a really big get. He's the opposite of Jennifer Rubin in every way, whereas he is someone I disagree with, but well thought out, well formulated arguments that are consistent, whereas Jen Rubin, ostensibly Republican on the right, publishes things that are, wild departures from what she used to believe with no explanation of why she has so dramatically changed her mind from first she was very anti-Mitt Romney, then she was very pro-Mitt Romney, so anti-Trump. All over the place. Paul Krugman is not like that.
No, he's not. And I'm sure Krugman will find, and has already found to some extent, an audience outside of the New York Times. One of the things I found about the reporting of this story a bit odd is it's almost a throwback to whenever, there was almost no digital media, and so other branches of the media would be obsessed with the New York Times and its inner workings, and there was this whole subgenre of kind of Kremlinology around the New York Times. So Krugman also spoke to the Columbia Journalism Review, and it gets into all the detail about the specific editor who he thinks was too heavy-handed, and then the Columbia Journalism Review goes and talks to people like Tom Friedman, who are New York Times columnists, who say, no, that editor's fantastic, and I'm delighted he's my editor. Patrick Healy is the editor in question. And so it just gets into the bowels of the New York Times and its editing processes in a way that I think is perhaps has a limited audience, but we'll see.
I do understand the New York Times' desire to limit how much media criticism its columnists are doing.
Be a very bad idea for writing.
There's nothing media people want to do more than do media criticism. I love media criticism. I do a newsletter every week on media criticism.
Right.
But Paul Krugman he's a celebrated economist.
Sure.
So keeping the gist of the most of his commentary there is I see why something they would want to do. Also, the New York Times has weird rules about you're not supposed to criticize
other
Times columnists in public, and which is kind of an interesting. So they do gatekeep a little bit what you're allowed to discuss in terms of the media. So that part of it was nothing new.
No, they do, and that has been the case for years, because this is going back a long time to my first years in the US. Whenever the Iraq War had happened, Judith Miller was very controversial, and Maureen Dowd, who was a Times columnist, definitely attacked her publicly in some fashion. I can't remember whether it was a Maureen Dowd column or not. Look, I get why news organizations, particularly ones as significant as the New York Times, don't want their columnists bashing each other in their columns. That seems bad.
Well, and generally in media, you don't most business places don't bash your colleagues publicly or don't disparage their work.
Yeah.
I save my disagreements with Niall Stanage for the table.
As we should.
Yes.
And it doesn't sound like you'll be a subscriber to Mr. Krugman's Substack anytime soon, despite his Nobel Prize-winning pedigree.
His big mistake that he made, biggest mistake he ever made was, remember when he said that the internet would have proved to have no more impact on our way of life than the fax machine or something like that.
Something like that.
That did not quite pan out, my friend.
Not the greatest prediction, but any of us who make predictions are always vulnerable to being made to look idiots.
I just go back and delete all my incorrect predictions on X. So you'll
That's a very Trumpian attitude. Just delete history when it's inconvenient.
Maybe they'll put my face on Mount Rushmore.
Maybe they will. I'm sure it'll be delightful for us all.
That does it for us today on Rising. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can find podcasts.